Well, good evening. We are to story time. This is going out to all the many, many people who enjoy a good story just around this time of the evening as we 2020 into 2021. I don't see why it shouldn't. The lockdown or the semi-lockdown or whatever you want to call it is certainly continuing into 2021. So seems to me that story time should as well. Tonight we're having Irish. I don't know. Kurt Vonnegut certainly wasn't Irish, but we'll have Irish anyway. I didn't know Kurt Vonnegut's stories, his novels, except for Harris and Bergeron. Cheers. Kurt Vonnegut was one of those writers that I was aware of when I was in high school. People were always carrying around Kurt Vonnegut paperbacks or Hermann Hesse paperbacks, Siddhartha, the cool girls at St. Anne's School. They were always carrying around Hermann Hesse. I've no idea. Does anybody read him anymore? Who knows? So I never did. And I didn't read Kurt Vonnegut, and Ken Kesey I avoided. I remember avoiding Ken Kesey in high school. I later corrected that on a production of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and found it quite fascinating. But this is my first Kurt Vonnegut story, and it was introduced to me by a Russian acquaintance. And that makes perfect sense, because if you come from a totalitarian society, then Harrison Bergeron is going to really, really resonate with you. It's resonate with us now as we contemplate the triumph and ascendancy of mediocrity. And maybe I'm incorrect in that. Maybe mediocrity isn't in ascendance. We could have a vigorous discussion about that if you like. But I think there's something to be said for an elevation of mediocrity in our culture. Now, that really makes me seem pompous and old. I suppose I am pompous. I might even be old. Oh, well, never mind. Enough of this. Fall de roll. Let's hear the story, and if you have thoughts, please let me know. As always, I'm on the lookout for stories for story time. I think we're going to really dig into it the winter of 2021 because, frankly, it's a good time to dig into great stories and ponder them, and it'll keep me on my toes and I hope bring you some enjoyment. So cuddle up with a loved one or a loved animal or a loved stuffed animal. Sit there in front of the hearth, warm your feet by the fire, pour yourself some Irish or some scotch, or have a beer, or a hot chocolate, glass of water, any of the above will do. And let's listen to Harris and Bergeron by Kurt Vonnegut Jr., written in 1961. The year was 2081, and everybody was. They weren't only for God and the law. They were equal every which way. Nobody was smarter than anybody else. Nobody was better looking than anybody else. Nobody was stronger or quicker than anybody. All this equality was due to the 211th, 212th, and 213th Amendments and to the unceasing vigilance of agents of the United States Handicapper General. Some things about living still weren't quite right, though. April, for instance, still drove people crazy by not being springtime. And it was in that clammy month that the Handicapper General men, or HG men, took George and Hazel Bergeron's 14-year-old son, Harrison, away. It was tragic, all right, but George and Hazel couldn't think about it very hard. Hazel had a perfectly average intelligence, which meant she couldn't think about anything except in short bursts. And George, while his intelligence was way above normal, had a little mental handicap radio in his ear. He was required by law to wear it at all times. It was tuned to a government transmitter. Every 20 seconds or so, the transmitter would send out some sharp noise to keep people like George their advantage of their brains. George and Hazel were watching television. There were tears on Hazel's cheeks, but she'd forgotten for the moment what they were about. On the television screen, a buzzer sounded in George's head. His thoughts like bandits from a burglar alarm. That dance they just did, said Hazel. Huh, said that dance. It was nice, said Hazel. Yep, said George. About the ballerina. They weren't really very good, no better than anybody else would have been anyway. They were burdened with sash weights and bags of birdshot, and their faces were masked so that no one seeing a free and graceful gesture or a pretty face would feel like something the cat drug in. George was toying with the vague notion that maybe dancers shouldn't be handicapped. But he didn't get very far with it before another noise in his ear radio scattered his thoughts. Winced. So did two. Saw him. Having no mental handicap herself, she had to ask George what the latest sound had been. It sounded like somebody hitting a milk bottle with a ball-peen hammer, said George. I'd think it would be real interesting hearing all the different sounds, Hazel said, a little envious. All the things they think up. Only, if I was Handicapper General, do you know what I would do? Said Hazel. Hazel, as a matter of fact, bore a strong resemblance to the Handicapper General, a woman named Diana Moon Glampers. If I was Diana Moon Glampers, said Hazel, I'd have chimes on Sunday. Just chimes. Kind of in honor of religion. I could think if it was just chimes, said George. Well, maybe make 'em real loud, said Hazel. I think I'd make a good Handicapper General. Good as anybody else, said George. Better than normal is. Right, said George. He began to think glimmeringly about his abnormal son, who was now in jail, about Harrison. But a 21-gun salute it was such a dude. He was white and trembling on the rims of his red eyes. 2 of the 8 ballerinas had collapsed to the studio floor, were holding their temples. All of a sudden you look so tired, said Hazel. Why don't you stretch out on the sofa so's you can rest your handicap bag on the pillows, honey bunch? She was referring to the 47 pounds of canvas bag, which was padlocked around George's neck. "Go on, rest the bag for a little while," she said. "I don't care if you're not equal to me for a while." George weighed the bag with his hands. "I don't mind it," he said. "I don't notice it anymore. It's just part of me." "You've been so tired lately. Kind of wore out," said Hazel. If there was just some way we could make a little hole in the bottom of the bag and just take out a few of them lead balls. Just a few." 2 years in prison and $2,000 fine for every ball I took out," said George. "I don't call that a bargain." "If you could just take a few out when you come home from work," said Hazel. "I mean, you don't compete with anybody around here. You just sit around." "If I tried to get away with it," said George, "then other people would get away with it. Pretty soon we'd be right back in the dark ages again, with everybody competing against everybody else. You wouldn't like that, would you?" "I'd hate it," said Hazel. "There you are," said George. "The minute people start cheating on laws, what do you think happens to society?" Hazel hadn't been able to come up with an answer to this question. George couldn't have supplied one. A siren was going off in his head. "Reckon it'd fall all apart," said Hazel. "What would?" said George blankly. "Society," said Hazel uncertainly. "What you just said?" "Who knows?" said George. Only interrupted for a news bulletin. It wasn't clear at first as to what the bulletin was about, since the announcer, like all announcers, had a speech impediment. For about half a minute, and in a state of high excitement, the announcer tried to say, "Ladies and gentlemen." He finally gave up. He handed the bulletin to a ballerina to read. "That's Hazel of the announcement. He tried. He tried to do the best he could with what God gave him. He should get a nice raise for trying so hard." "Ladies and gentlemen," said the ballerina, reading the bulletin. She must have been extraordinarily beautiful, because the mask she wore was hideous. It's easy to see that she was the strongest and most graceful of all the dancers, for her handicap bags were as big as those worn by men. And she had to apologize, which was a very unfair voice for a woman to use. Her voice was a warm, luminous, timeless melody. "Excuse me," she said, and she began again, making absolutely uncompetitive. "Harrison Bergeron, age 14, she said in a grackle squawk, "has just escaped from jail, where he was held on suspicion of plotting to over an athlete, is under-handicapped, and should be regarded as extremely dangerous." A police photograph of Harrison Bergeron was flashed on the screen, upside down, then sideways, upside down again, and then right side up. The picture showed the full length of Harrison against a background, calibrated in feet and inches. He was exactly 7 feet tall. The rest of Harrison's appearance was Halloween and hardware. Nobody had ever borne heavier handicaps. He had outgrown hindrances faster than HG men could think them up. He had outgrown hindrances faster than HG men could think them up. Instead of a little ear radio for a mental handicap, He wore a tremendous pair of earphones and spectacles with thick, wavy lenses. The spectacles were intended to make him not only half blind, but to give him whanging headaches besides. Scrap metal was hung all over him. Ordinarily, there was a certain symmetry, a military neatness issued to strong people, but Harrison looked like a walking. In the race of life, Harrison carried 300 pounds. And to good looks, the HG men required that he wear at all times a red rubber ball for a nose, keep his eyebrows shaved off, and cover his even white teeth with black cat snaggletooth random. "If you see this boy," said the ballerina, "do not, I repeat, do not try to reason with him." There was the shriek of a door being torn from its hinges. Screams and barking cries of consternation came from the television set. The photograph of Harrison Bergeron on the screen jumped again and again as though dancing to the tune of an earthquake. George Bergeron correctly identified the earthquake, and well he might have, for many was the time his own home had danced to the same crashing tune. My God! The realization was blasted from his mind instantly by the sound of an automobile collision in his head. When George could open his eyes again, the photograph of Harrison was gone. A living, breathing Harrison filled the screen. Clanking, clownish, and huge, Harrison stood in the center of the studio. The knob of the uprooted studio door was still in his hand. Ballerinas, technicians, dancers cowered before him, expecting to die. "I am," cried Harrison. "Do you hear? I am the Emperor! Everybody must do what I say." And the studio shook. "As I stand here," he bellowed, "crippled, hobbled, sickened, I am a than any man who ever lived. Now watch me become what I can become." Harrison tore the straps of his handicap harness like wet tissue paper, tore to support five. Harrison's scrap iron handicaps crashed to the floor. Harrison thrust his thumbs under the block that secured his head. The bar snapped like celery. Harrison smashed his headphones and spectacles against the wall. Away his rubber ball nose revealed a man that would have awed Thor, the god of thunder. "I shall now select my down on. Let the first woman who dares rise to her feet claim her and her throne." A moment passed, and then a ballerina arose, swaying like a willow. Harrison plucked the mental handicap from her ear, snapped off her physical handicaps with marvelous delicacy. Last of all, he removed her mask. Blindingly beautiful. And taking her hand, "Shall we show the people the meaning of the word dance?" "Music!" he commanded. The musicians scrambled back to their chairs, and Harrison stripped them of their handicaps too. "Play your best! I'll make you barons and dukes and earls." The music began. It was normal at first, cheap, silly, false. But Harrison snatched two musicians from their chairs, waved them like batons as he sang the music as he wanted it played. The music began again and was much improved. Harrison and his empress merely listened to the music for a while, listened gravely, as though synchronizing their heartbeats with it. They shifted their weights to their toes. Harrison placed his big hands on the girl's tiny waist, letting her sense the weightlessness that would soon be hers. And then, in an explosion of joy and grace, into the air they sprang. Not only were the laws of the land abandoned, but the law of gravity and the laws of motion as well. They reeled, whirled, swiveled, flounced, capered, gamboled, and spun. They leapt like deer on the moon. The studio ceiling was 30 feet high. It brought the dancers nearer to it. It became their obvious intention to kiss the ceiling. They kissed it. And then, neutraling gravity with love and pure will, they remained suspended in air below the ceiling, and they kissed each other for a long, long time. It was then that Diana Moon Glampers, the handicapped shotgun. She fired twice, and the Emperor and Empress were dead before they hit the floor. Diana Moon Glampers loaded the gun again. She aimed it at the musicians and told them they had 10 seconds to get their handicaps back on. It was then that the Bergeron's television tube burned out. He turned to comment about the blackout to George. But George had gone out into the kitchen for a can of beer. George came back in with the beer, paused while a handicap signal shook him up, and then he sat down again. "You've been crying," he said to him. "Yep," she said. "What about?" he said. "I forget. Something real sad on television." "What was it?" he said. "It's all mixed up in my mind." "Forget Sam," said George. "I always do," said Hazel. "That's my girl," said George. He winced. There was a fitting gun in his head. "Gee, I could tell that one was a doozy," said Hazel. "You can say that again," said George. "Gee," said Hazel, "I could tell that one was a doozy." Harrison Bergeron, copyrighted by Kurt Vonnegut Jr. in 1960. Well, there it is. It's good, isn't it? Very, very well. That was just a wonderful story. That's all I can say. I loved it. I'm going to read some Kurt Vonnegut, perhaps. Slaughterhouse-Five is his most famous book. That's a World War II novel about the bombing of Dresden, I think. So maybe I'll read that. Maybe I'll just keep going with the short stories. Please, if you have an idea for a short story, then I want you to let me know, because I will look at it. It's my pleasure to share these with you. Here's to you. Here's to Kurt Vonnegut Jr. Here's to Harrison Bergeron. Here's to the with Harrison Bergeron. And here's to getting through this winter with as much grace and aplomb as we can. So thank you for joining me for story time. My warmest wishes to you.